just happy to be here. I've got my partner in crime is also here in the chat somewhere around. So happy to just make community with you all during this time. So I appreciate you taking the time. And this makes for a good story. So. Oh my goodness. My goodness.
That was not me.
That wasn't you? That just happened out of the blue.
That was Rochelle.
Okay, hey, whatever. Hey, however it works. Fantastic.
Right. Thank you. Okay, all right. I'm going to have to figure out what she did for next time. Thank you so much for sticking with us through this. I'm very excited to formally introduce our speaker today, Dr. Aris from the Gwinnett Community College in Georgia. And he'll be talking to us today about units. So without further ado, let's kick it off.
I appreciate that. I'll do some introductions. Okay, wait, I got to make sure I see. Okay, I got the new comments. Julie, welcome. Or Nura, I love that. Love that name. So we'll do some introductions, I'll talk about myself and my partner in crime. Talk about a framework that we've been working on for the last 4 years. One of the elements of that framework is units. And then so excited to talk with you all and to be a part of this community. Lots of ways that we can do this. So I'll be looking in the chat. This is one of the things I'm liking about StreamYard is that I can actually see the chat as opposed to Zoom where I'm just like, where's the chat? People are saying stuff. So if you got questions, you can ask them on the way. I've got 30 minutes to talk and then we just get the chat, but I don't mind chatting on the way also. Really just trying to engage with everybody. I had also mentioned to Zane that looking forward to also chatting with her as we do this. I did not want to sit here and talk. I'm a lecturer. I can lecture. I did not want to do that. So it's the summer. I'm not lecturing this summer. So let's have lots of great interaction. Who are we? I have the honor of being the co-conspirator with Dr. Kyle Clark, who is a PhD in material science from the University of California, Berkeley, who is the principal engineer, materials engineer at Microworks. I am Aris Winger. I'm an associate professor at Georgia Gwinnett College. I am also the executive director of the National Association of Mathematicians. So how this all started was about 4 years ago, in which we really started to dive in to charts and how charts were impacting the world. And as you know about 4 years ago. So 4 years ago, we were thrown into an absolute disaster of a time where we were, as a global nation, in the most vulnerable spot that we had been in our history in modern times in lots of ways. And what was happening was that, our leaders were giving us charts in ways that were kind of unprecedented, maybe outside of the market crash of 2008, the housing crisis of 2008. But now at this time, we're getting these charts from our leaders, as you can see. And then down there is my state of Georgia. I'm in Georgia. And so I was seeing charts like that, which were problematic, if you can see why. And so Dr. Clark and I were just like, well, wait, what is it that we can notice and see and do about this? And so that really, we embarked on a 4-year voyage to just look at the chart after chart after chart to think about how is it that we can think about the regular population really being able to engage with the chart. Now, I'm excited to be with you because I know that there's a community, particularly in the Data Visualization Society, which I'm so thankful for the invite, really has on their side lots of chart makers. And we are, Dr. Clark and I are on the side of the chart viewer, right? And so the framework we created initially was for the chart viewer, but we're excited to think about how our framework can really be used. And we've been using it with organizations as they make charts to make sure, our goal, of course, is to make sure that every individual who views a chart has a way of looking at a chart, not to be fooled, not to be manipulated, to get deeper understanding, to leave with more questions than answers about a chart instead of making false and quick conclusions. And so we're really interested in creating a framework for people to engage with charts. So that framework we call values, and it's an acronym. And so it's based on the visual. What is it that you're seeing when you first see a chart? How are the axes, which are broadly defined, labeled? How are they named? What are we talking about? The units we'll talk about today, in lots of ways, of the language of the numbers that you see. Every chart, we believe, should come with an explanation. What is being said about the chart in the chart itself? And of course, the source is who made this and how did I encounter it. In total, these are 6 questions, and that is tied to our forthcoming book, When 1,000 Words Fail, 6 liberating questions to ask to go beyond the visual. Today, we're talking about units in particular, and the question tied to it is, what language are we using when we are talking about a number? We have a broad definition of units. A unit is a descriptor of a number that gives some contextual meaning. And so you may come across numbers all the time. You probably do in your life. And the question is, do you just hear the number, or is there something attached to that number, right? And if there is, we would call that thing the units. So 15 miles per hour, the units for that number are miles per hour. 3 rabbits per square mile, 4 pencils per student, 2.3 kilometers, 125,374 people. And as I was making this example, this slide here, I was just trying to throw out anything, right? And so this is how broad our definition is, right? Any descriptor of the number in question. Even when we see rabbits per square mile, that alone starts to tell a story, right? So in our book, we define a chart, and I would imagine the Data Visualization Society crew does something similar. A chart is a visualized story of data, right? A chart is a visualized narrative of data. And so even when you look at the units here and you see rabbits per square mile, you already get an image of like, oh my goodness, 1 mile by 1 mile. How many rabbits are in there? Looks like there are 3. What could that be? What, is someone studying them? 4 pencils per student. What story is behind that, right? And so we have a deep belief that units are important. Our former and future president was in a battle with an Axios reporter, Jonathan Swan, about units, about what was going on in the world, right? And so we go in depth about this conversation in the book, in which Swan says, "Oh, you're doing death as a proportion of cases. I'm talking about death as a proportion of population." The former president said, "Well, you can't do that. Why can't I do that? You have to go by cases. Why not as a proportion of population?" So they have this back and forth about units, right? And so, and what I want you to hear me, that they are arguing about the state of the world based on the type of number they want to use, right? The type of units they want to use to describe the numbers. And so I'm sure you can still find this on YouTube and in lots of places if you just Google it. But the back and forth is for us was wild, right? Because as we had started to get the book together, and then all of a sudden this conversation shows up. And so this gives you an idea that units are superbly important in terms of how we want to talk about the world. And as you're making charts, your decisions on which units to use will make a tremendous amount of impact on who reads them and who you're trying to convince or who you're trying to inform. I got 3 remarks, and then we'll get to talking. And we can talk now. Questions, comments, throw them in the chat if you have them. Every number should have units, right? And so that's a belief that we have, that we just can't say 7 in all practicality. We can't say 7. We need to say 7 bottles, 7 books, 7 windows, 7 fans, right? 7 whatever, 7 letters. Every number should have units if you're having a conversation. It is true mathematically that there are some numbers that don't have units, like pi. Pi technically has no units, but pi is only because we cancel the units. And I'm not a fan of canceling anymore, right? Because if you cancel the units, you have 3.14159, blah, 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 right? And then you put no units on it. Well, pi is the ratio of distance to distance. And therefore the distance is canceled and it has no units, right? But it might be important to think about what happens if you don't cancel, because if we think about pi as units of distance divided by units of distance, then you kind of have the definition there, right? That it's the ratio of two distances. In this case, the distance around to the distance, the radius, right? So, or the diameter. So, so we're a big believer in units being attached to every single number. Every number should have a descriptor. And here is why. So I've been thinking about my health recently, a couple of years ago, a year and a half ago. I went to the doctor. I was like, yo, I'm getting up there in age. I'm not going to tell you how old I'm 46. I'm getting up there in age. I was like, yo, doc, what I got to do? You know, what's going on? I got my colorectal screening coming, the prostate cancer, all of this stuff is happening now. I'm crossing thresholds, or I got to start to do stuff about my health. And so I went and made a visit. And then, you know, the day or two after, I went in, and then they gave me results because they checked me for diabetes and all these other things, right? And so I saw this chart in my own health profile. Now, I'm not going to out who my health provider is, but I'm going to need some of your help in order to correct them, right? So I'm collecting a legion of people on this call to follow me and contact this group and say, we can do better than this. How is it possible, fam of mine, that I can look at a chart about my own life and it doesn't have any units? How is that possible? And in lots of ways, for the hundreds of dollars I'm spending per month for health insurance, shouldn't I get a chart about my life that not only has the units, but has the explanation? Now, one can say the explanation's there, right? Your heart stroke risk sometime in the next 10 years is low. All right, so the explanation is there as we would define it in the book. Now, they also say the word risk. So I'm gonna open it up to my people in the comments. What do you think 1.8 means, right? Now, I have to be honest. I'm afraid to ask my doctor because I'm afraid my doctor will mess it up. And then I'm going to lose all faith. And I'm like, never going to that. I'm never going back to him again. That's right. 1 point. Carter, thank you. I appreciate that. Right. 1.8 panda bears worth of risk. Right. So if it's risk, it feels like it might be a percentage. And we'll talk about percentages later. Right. A percentage of what? Percentage of what in the world does that mean? Right. And maybe, right, I should just, because initially I was like, well, wait, it's low. Let me click. I clicked off the tab and I was like, okay, it's low. Let me move on. And then I was like, well, wait, I'm writing this book with Dr. Clark. I need to go, wait, where are the units? Wait, like, where's the sentence that tells me what this really means for me? Right? That explanation is unacceptable. That explanation is unacceptable, right? And I think that there are lots of us in this world that will look at that, see that I'm in the low region and be like, okay, we're good. Not anymore. Not anymore, right? Because what is the slippery slope there when we're oh my goodness, good afternoon, everybody. When we're scrolling through Twitter, when we're scrolling through Facebook, and we see things that don't have units, and we say, oh, okay, that's fine, I'm good, right? When we do that for other charts, when we build those bad habits, or when we continue to maintain those bad habits, what are the consequences when someone tries to convince us and we look at something for 15 seconds and we move on? We're not going to do that anymore, right? And as chart makers, what does it look like, right, when we go to this institution and say, yo, you got to do better than this? Let's have a sentence at the bottom that says, here's what this means for you over the next 10 years, right? So that was unsettling. Right. And so it was bittersweet because it was like, that's unsettling, but it was also like, okay, we got lots of work to do. Right. So, yeah, there's lots of space to talk about what we can do with these types of numbers. From billion-dollar institutions are doing this nonsense. Right. That are being this, and lazy is not the right word, but being this inattentive to assigning value to each number. Ooh, Carter's got another idea. Likelihood ratio, serious answer, 1.8 times the higher risk of heart or stroke, not heart attack, heart. Right. Maybe. Right. Maybe that's it. I was thinking maybe that, are they saying that maybe I have a 1.8% chance versus the norm versus people who have my same profile versus, yeah. Yeah.
And the ranges are also interesting. It's like the highest risk somebody could be is 15.
Well, no,
Really?
and that's why, yes. And so I was hoping that it was a percentage, because if it's 15%, thank you for that. If it's 15%, then I'm like, okay, then I would think that if someone had a 50% chance of getting a heart stroke in the next 10 years, I would think that that would be an alarm. And I'm assuming that anything higher than that would even be more, and they just didn't put it down there, right? But look at all the assumptions we had. Look at all the guesswork we're putting forth just to try and figure out something about my life, right? And I wish I could say that that was just the beginning. But then they just roll along, fam. Chart after chart, no units to be found. Thankfully, some of these I can guess. I assume this is in Fahrenheit, right? Right? Like, yeah, and then not to mention the axes, right? Like, these aren't even the dates I visited, right? So yeah, so I'm gathering people to go to this crew and to be like, yo, you need to hire us as consultants for millions of dollars, right? Like, we need to revamp this whole thing. I'm also intrigued. The last time I was on one of these as a viewer, we were talking about AI. I'm also intrigued about what AI could do. How can we, as the experts, train AI to take a chart like this and make the explanation, put the units down, right? How could we do that? I know that might threaten us, putting some of us out of business, right? But how is it that we can get this kind of automated? Because where did this come from? Whatever they're programming this to come from, there's some things that are not in there, right? Remark number 2. Large numbers impact units. Okay, and so 1 million seconds is 11 days. A billion seconds is, of course, 1,000 times that. That's 31 years. A trillion seconds is 1,000 times that, which is 31,000 years. 31,000 years ago was the Ice Age, right? And so these, large numbers start to get out of our intuitive understanding pretty quickly. And so I have done something here, without saying it explicitly. I've come up with alternative units, right? And so when numbers get so large, and we do this already, right, with the metric system at least, that when you multiply something by 1,000, it kind of pushes it out of the units, right? So if we have meters, 1,000 meters, we don't call it 5,000 meters. We say 5,000 kilometers, right? Because it becomes not okay to try to compare the two. Like, you have to just decide whether we're going to talk about the big thing or talk about the small thing. I got an example on this in just a moment. But this is just to say that if we're putting large numbers with things, then it kind of changes how we think about, yes, 5 kilometers. I hope I said that. Yes, five kilometers. Yeah. And so when numbers get large, it pushes us out of the regular units we're going to use. And so another chart we talk about is one that should have never been made, right? Like when, and this is in part, now again, let's step back, all the way back. Much love to Yahoo News, but the bottom line is, when we think about our data journalists or our journalists who work with data, we have to think about how are they interacting with units as well, right? 60.8 million and 12,000 should never be on the same chart, right? And so even if the immensity of the numbers themselves don't give us the intuition that they should not be on the same chart, units help us out here, because 60.8 million and 12,000 are not the same units. And so we don't have this as one of the remarks, but remark 1A is that if we're talking about numbers with different units, we are going to get in a lot of places, right? And so if we're talking about a particular category, we should be using the same units. 60.8 million and 12,000 are not the same units, right? Now, this happens to be cases, right? Cases and deaths, right? And so if we're talking, so the units you might think are just cases, or you might think are just deaths, but the immensity of the numbers forces the 60.8 million out of the same category as the 12,000. And pictorially, it becomes clear that if we scale this correctly, the 60.8 million completely eviscerates and renders the other thing invisible. They're not the same units in lots of ways. And so when you're making charts or when you're viewing them, right, really thinking about what these large numbers might mean by thinking about alternative units, how is it I can think about this number in different ways, can be helpful. So that large numbers can impact the units you're thinking about. I got one more. I don't want to say the F word, right? Because I know that we have, fractions. I know that, we all have a different relationship with the greatest discipline in the history of people, mathematics and statistics. We all have a different relationship. And I know that we all, let's just say it this way, we've taught fractions very badly, right, for a very long time, right? And so it's hard to teach fractions, and we have not taught fractions as well as I think we should have in primary school. Fractions are everywhere, though, right? And in really thinking about how they show up and what they mean is supremely crucial. So indeed, when we're thinking about making our charts and fractions show up, percentages show up, how is it that we're going to decide to explain them, right? And so I'm using a very broad version of fractions, right? So fractions show up as one number divided by another. They show up as probabilities. They show up as averages. They show up as ratios. They show up as a proportion equation. Right? So there are all of these ways to think about fractions. And so if I say 1/3 of the people belong to group A, I could also say the ratio of group A to not group A is 1:2, or I could say the probability of being in group A is 33.3%, right? Rounding, of course, right? And so we know the problem with that is that all of those are simplifications of what is actually happening. As my colleague, Dr. Clark, was saying, well, he says it as an engineer, well, what's the end, right? What's the total number, right? And I think that we also like to say is, well, what is this out of, right? And of course, we know that there are problems with the average, right? The average score of a group on the test is 75. Does that mean that the group has 2 people in it and someone got 100 and someone got a 50? Does that mean that the group has 50 people in it and 25 people got 100 and 25 people got 50? Does that mean that all 50 got 75? Does that mean, right? And so these fractions are always showing up, and we are obsessed with the average one. We love the average, right? But of course, we know we should not be looking at the average without thinking about, well, what is this out of? And of course, what's the distribution of the values? The central question for fractions across the board, probabilities, ratios, fractions themselves, averages, what is this out of? In other words, what is the, not to sound too mathy, what is the denominator? What is this really out of? So a classic example, of course, is the wage gap, right? And so as we look at this chart here, we see the wage gap across different ethnicities and races. And so we see the chart maker here decided to use Asian and say, well, look, here is what we define to be the wage gap. Now, you already know that I'm already going to have a problem with this because we see 19%. And of course, 19% of what? 19% of what? And this is something that, again, we may be able to figure out. But again, what is the chart maker's responsibility to say what the 19% is of, right? And it so happens to be that a choice was made about the definition that when we look at white, non-Hispanic, and that says 20%, that red piece turns out to be, I would imagine, 20% of the yellow piece, right? And so we define the wage gap to mean what the percentage that we would need to add to how much a woman is making in that category in order to get the men's wage, right? And all of that is here, right? All of that is here, and none of that is being said. And is that okay? Right? Oh, Andrew brings up a great point about a small number topic here too, right? And so, I think from a mathematician's perspective, they're basically equivalent. if there's a because you just do the reciprocal, right? If there is a challenge with large numbers and our loss of intuition there, then very similarly, there'll be a very much challenge to having very, very small numbers. I think that's absolutely right. Yes, no, I think that's true. No, that's good. I think that's a great point that he brings up in the chat. And so here, and thinking about all the ways when you make this chart, all the ways of then what do you say to the person you're reporting to when you make this chart, right? So you could say that Asian men earn 1.19 times what Asian women occur. You might say that for every dollar a black woman earns, a black man earns 4 cents more. You could say that for every $10,000 a white woman earns, a white man earns $2,000 more, right? And so those first three kind of come directly from the chart, right? But then there's another formulation, right? Because what happens is when you look at this, it's been defined in terms of what women earn, which makes sense to me. Someone else could say, well, wait, if you look at across all races, for every $1,000 a man makes, a woman makes roughly $862.07. That's equivalent, right? So that if you look at how much less, right, how much would you have to take away from a man to make what a woman makes? You could also frame that whole thing that way, right? But the issue with the percentage, of course, here is that, is it clear that we're taking the percentage of the yellow? And maybe it is, right? But it's something, of course, to consider. One last thing to consider, of course, is what happens when 10%, or when should 10% become 100%, right? Where you might be working in a lab, you might be working for a business, and they run tests and say, well, we have a 90% success rate, right? And so that's great, right? And so here we are again with this percentage. And so our first question, of course, is 90% of what? 90% of what? 90% of what? Right? What is it that we're talking about, right? And so we could have a whole group made up of A, B, and C. None of them intersect, right? And so maybe group A is 50%, group B is 40%, and group C is 10%. And maybe you run test one, right, for success, and you get 45, 36, and 9. And that's 90% of each of these, which is going to be 90% of the total. You run test two, and then 100% of A, 100% of B, and none of C, right? That's also 90% success rate. And the question is, if we only pay attention to the 90% success rate, then we might be missing out on the fact that group C, there's something going on. Now, I've come on this call with you to talk to you in part about here we have a choice. We either, of course, get to say that there's something wrong with group C or there's something wrong with test two, right? And so I need us all to pause to, when we're making tests, when we put all this work in to put forth a survey or whatever it is, right? And we're deeply intertwined with the success of the thing we make, right? Then it might be easy to point fingers and say, oh, there's something, apparently group C, there's something wrong with them, right? When in fact, it might be something that's going on with our test, right? So again, here's another example of, oh, a percentage shows up. It can mean lots and lots of things if we don't get more in depth. Now, what I've learned is that lots of us are in the boardroom. We go in front and we got 15 minutes to talk to the big wig, right? And so lots of people, I was on a call with the brilliant Steve Wexler, right? When he was talking about our job as chart makers is to get the most understanding with the least amount of effort, right? And that quote is in the book, is because it's one that we struggle with, right? This balance between, oh, let me get the point quickly. Let me just get to the point because time is money. We got to go. We got to go. We got to go. You all are working in BI and in Tableau, trying to make the clearest charts possible, trying to say, look, this thing works 90% of the time. Let's move on. Let's move on. Let's move on. Right. And I've come on here to be with you to say, yes, we can do that. And it might just also be a success to leave a chart with more questions than answers. To say, well, let's go a little bit deeper. Oh, that's wonderful, but let's make sure we attend to A, B, and C next time, or this afternoon, or right before we just say everything's fine just because the number is near 100, right? So every number should have units attached. Large numbers change units. Fractions are large part of numerical descriptions of charts and can be expressed in a variety of ways. And we're always asking, wait, what is this out of? What is this out of? What's the distribution? What is this out of? Right. All right, if you want to collaborate, we would be super excited for that to happen. There's a QR code to fill out a couple of questions so we can figure out, go with the torches to my health provider and say, yo, this has got to change, and we can help you change it. Really, really thankful for you all listening and looking forward to any questions you have for me. My partner in crime is also in the background somewhere. If he clicks on that link, he can join us too, and we'll answer your questions and have a conversation if we like.
Well, I have a question. So
please.
In remark 2, you're talking about how large numbers impact units and showed this graph with like 60 million and 12,000. And so naturally, if showing the raw numbers is problematic because 1 million and 1,000 and 10,000 are so far apart on the scale, what is the good solution? Like my mind automatically goes to ratios, but you said ratios are bad. And then
I think ratios comes back to the issue that Andrew brings up, right? Because if you simplify, then it's going to be 1 H1N1 to 0.00000, like, and then we don't even know what that means. No, and I meant when I said that this should have never been made. Like what? So answer me on the chat. What is the purpose of this? Like, so in other words, like, and so I think this is the breakthrough on units. If 60.8 million is out of the stratosphere, Dr. Clark, welcome. If 60.8 million is out of the stratosphere of 12,469, then they shouldn't be, I don't think they should be compared under any circumstances. Like what is it that we're trying to say? I mean, we might as well just say that they're just way more, right? I mean, writing the fraction is so close to 0, like we're okay with saying, well, it's basically nothing. Look at the chart. Right. And that may be risky or controversial or extreme. But yeah, look at what's happening. Look at this, right? Like someone at a reputable news source decided that this was okay to make. Yeah, I mean.
Well, so the takeaway that I'm getting here is that this chart just should not exist. This, when you're talking about this ratio, it should be a sentence. It shouldn't be visual because the visual is so misleading. But there are situations where your boss does want a chart. What would be the solution?
Right? No, I do want to turn to Dr. Clark for this one. Dr. Clark is in industry as an engineer. He's not naming names, but I'm interested in your thoughts on that.
Yeah, sometimes you get put in exactly this position, and there might not be a good chart for it, and that's where you use your sentence, but then you have to start breaking that number down into you have to play with your alternative units, comparing it to other things that, depending on what industry you're in, within the group that you're in, within the company you're in, you probably have some of these that you're using regularly that you could maybe relate these to in a better way, as opposed to just presenting the straight number itself. Because if you show something like this, you get out of the, you would probably present what is on the right. And I have seen what is on the right presented, but then you have your chart, but you're not actually showing anything of relevance, and it just leads to more confusion than just keeping with the sentence or finding some other way to represent it.
No, that's powerful.
We have some questions from the chat, but Kyle, I just want to note there's some sort of weird feedback with your mic. I think there's a loud, high-pitched noise.
I didn't hear that at all. I'm sorry.
Maybe it's just me then. I will look into that.
Yeah, let's ask the chat to make sure. Are you hearing a loud, high-pitched noise when Dr. Clark speaks? Priya says, thanks, that was a great talk. What about the practice of adding lines in the middle of the bar to indicate a break in the axis? So we're not doing that here, but I think I've seen that practice. Yeah, so I'm not a fan of it. I'm not a fan of, I think I've seen where you put a little break and say, oh, there's this gap. I think we need to see the whole axis, right? I'm much more of a fan of that so that we just know what's going on. I'm a fan of more information. Again, if you have to break the axis, you need a real reason why. And I'm open. I'm open to why you would break the axis, what benefit it has for you. Again, we are skeptical. Like we want the public to be skeptical about charts and asking lots of questions. And so breaking the axis doesn't make me less skeptical about what's going on. I'm willing to change my mind, of course. Susan asks, how to convince chart viewers that they ought to be paying attention to out of what and what the distribution looks like. In my experience, they just want the number, typically on average, and want to know which group is higher without. No, I absolutely love Susan. That is a great point. I think what we have to do is show them the consequences when we make the mistake. And when we're in the business world, I think that means here's what money we can lose. Like, I think, so it's true that some education needs to happen, like buying our book. But some education needs to happen in terms of like, how is it that we can explain to coworkers like, oh, I just want the number, but yo, if you only look at this number, look at all of what you might be missing. Look at this information that's crucial if we don't look elsewhere in addition to the out of what, right? And so I think providing examples of charts and like, yo, read this, because because particularly with the average, right? As I said, with the 75 test score, that could mean a million different things. And there's some great examples out there with data that you can make data look all sorts of ways and make the chart look all sorts of ways with data that's very, very similar. That's problematic. So I think we need to gain some narrative language to say, yes, I know we're interested in this one number, but this one number can lead us in lots of different ways. And that could cost us tens, thousands, millions of dollars if we don't look at it right. Kamal says, your comment about over relying on averages stood out to me. Can you expound more on that? And maybe think of how much Gen AI models sometimes rely on finding averages of massive data sets. What might they be missing? Oh, yes. I wish I could say, take all the credit for this great work. The average is so problematic on its own, right? Just with the 75, right? But when you don't, put the spread or the distribution of the values with it, then the number on its own could mean, and we have lots of stories in the book about this, but the number on its own could mean all sorts of things. As I said before, that if you say the average is 75 of a group, then what's left out is that how many are in the group, and then if there are 100 in the group, did 100, then they all get the same number. I wanted to step back. So the average of a group is the number that they would all have if they all had the same amount, right? And that if is huge. When you look at the average of a group or the average of a test, it's of 50 people, it's the amount that they would each have if they all had the same amount, right? And so if we remember that, then when we look at the average, we're supposing already that they all have the same amount. It's embedded in the definition. And so that almost never happens, right? And so, I mean, we use it as like an equalizing thing, as a way of saying, well, let's look at what a normal person, we think about average as the normal thing. We have to call this number into question, right? Because it's doing too much for us as a singular thing, right? And so again, to Susan's point, when we start, particularly when we're talking with AI people and they want to use the average, because let's be clear, they're working on such hard problems. And this happens all the time. You work on hard problems and just like, well, wait, what number are we going to use? And then they say, okay, well, let's just use the average. Let's just use the average, right? And then they move on to their hard stuff again because they need a number. Everyone likes the average. Everyone uses the average. And then we forget all these problematic things with it. So Kamal, you and us, we should talk more about that because I think that's a really, really good point. Carter has some thoughts about if you need to break the axis to see all the data, you're comparing values that shouldn't be on the same chart because the visual comparison isn't interesting or informative. Carter, I'm a big fan of you. I'm your number one fan. I could not have said that any better. So, oh, Zane, you've experienced this. Please tell us.
Well, as I wrote in the chat, the only exception to the breaking the bar guideline that I've seen that kind of makes sense is when you have just one that is so much higher than the others, kind of like the 60 million to 12,000, but showing the full height of that bar with the others compresses all these others, and
right,
because they're so small in comparison that you can't really like head or tail between them. And so breaking the bar for the really tall one allows you to compress it into regular size so you can really see the differences between the others. While still kind of getting the point across that this really tall bar is an outlier compared to all the others.
So I knew I would be learning a ton coming here with y'all today. Yeah, I'm thinking about that. Dr. Clark, your thoughts?
I think we actually played with this one.
Ever?
Sorry?
No, that was legible.
Oh, I think we played with that exact thing with this example here, and even breaking that 160 million down, the 1.6 million to 98,000 was still so large compared to that 12,000 that we could not see it.
Yeah. Again, no, this is great. Again, I'm willing to think about it. It's just hard to imagine, putting them on the same chart. Love it.
So I have a different question.
Please.
Can you talk a little bit about using logarithmic units? Because I feel like this is such a stumbling block for people. Is there like an intuitive way you've encountered to explain logarithmic units?
No, I struggle. No, this is great. So I can bias myself in that. I was reflecting on this last night about the logarithmic. Yes, my life is exciting. It is. So I was reflecting on this last night about logarithmic scale. And so again, remember where we're coming from. Can we, the person on the corner, the person at the corner of New York City, can I come to them and talk about this chart or give them this chart and have them understand it if the chart says that it's log scale? I want you all to change my mind. It feels intractable to talk to people about log scale. Now, one of our chart heroes, Alberto Cairo, he reviewed our book, and he was very, very skeptical that we were going to be able to get the general populace to really understand charts in the way that we were dreaming of it. And our response to him was chapter 4 on units, that if we can get people to understand units, then we will get people to understand charts, right? And so this is why chapter 4 is our longest chapter. This is why we want to write a whole book on units, right? I mean, if you look, we have some old chats that we had 4 years ago. It's like, we were writing a whole book about units. And so hopefully it's the units chapter that will do this. So I'm biased when I'm teaching at Georgia Gwinnett College that logs is in pre-calculus, right? The logarithm is a pre-calculus topic, it's a college algebra topic. And so this is like, how is it? And again, I'm willing to change my mind, but there's some work that has to be done to explain what a logarithm is for the general populace to understand. Now, again, when you're in the boardroom for my chart makers and you're just like, oh, this is log, right? We can start to work together to think about, well, what does this mean? How do we say it? What's the wording that we use? But at this moment, I'm skeptical and about bringing log charts to the general population today, because the logarithm is hard to explain, right? Like, change my mind, Dr. Clark.
I only know of a few very specific use cases that I would ever encounter them, and that's usually related to a specific test or measurement. But generally, I think it would be a very challenging thing to try to bring up.
Now, here's one way we can do it, right? Like, one way you can do it is that, again, it's hard. I'm about to fumble and hand wave like nobody's business, but you can say that these numbers are so large, we have scaled them down equivalently on both axes. And now you see that it's a linear, you see that when we applied the same transformation to each of the scales, you see the relationship clearly. And then we would not be able to literally see this relationship if we kept them in their original state, right? And so, I mean, we can find wording in terms of transformations that we've just moved to a new space where it's easier to see this relationship, and we see the relationship's one-to-one or has this high correlation in this space, and that the correlation doesn't change because we've changed the space. Now, I'm not about the business of hand waving, but if that gets you where you need to go and the people in the audience believe you, that's great. But then when people start asking questions about it, then you have to get deeper and deeper, and then all of a sudden you're in a pre-calculus class, right? I mean, that's the problem. These are great comments and questions. I didn't want to skip anybody here. So, yeah, okay, great. I think we're with Alex. We use averages to communicate a data story in a way that is digestible. In your example, the average is across 3 sets, but what if we have millions of data points? We can't communicate every data point in that case, but one average is too simplistic. But what are the considerations for a reasonable middle ground? Yeah, no, that's a great question, Alex, right? And so I'm excited that we are dealing with this average. And now this makes me think we need to make the chapter longer, Dr. Clark, for units. But like, yeah, I mean, I think we come from the perspective of that you give all the information you can, right? That makes sense, right? So you do want to talk about the average, but you do want to talk about the mean. I'm sorry, not the mean, the median. You do want to talk about the distribution. Like you want to put the distribution up, right? And so, statistics in lots of ways is based on what the distribution is, right? So if you have 1 million data points, put them up and show the distribution. So, and I don't know, and maybe that's intractable, right? Like you all need to tell me, right? In the business world, can you put up the distribution? What will the boss say? What will the panel say? Well, like, what does this mean? Or like, I cannot imagine 1 million data points and you not showing the distribution. That is beyond me, right? As a mathematician, right? And as someone who does statistics and someone who has consulted, like it's almost irresponsible to have that many data points and not show you the distribution of them and how they show up, and then mention the mean, and then you can say 45% are below, like 30% are over here. 20% of the people at Starbucks will come between these 2 times, right? You might imagine that Walmart, Kroger, Starbucks, they have millions of data points too. When it's time for them to talk about this stuff, you don't think they put up the distribution and say 45% of our people come between noon and 3 p.m.? And you don't think they might want to change the prices during that time or now offer food during that time because it's around lunchtime? Like, yeah, we got to show the distribution.
So I have another question.
Yeah.
So this comes from a class assignment where I was making a graph showing z-scores, right?
Yes.
And I was translating it for somebody who knows z-scores, like an academic, to the general populace who might not be familiar with z-scores or how to interpret them.
Yeah.
And to me, the best solution seemed to be to get rid of the z-scores and just replace it with a lower than average or higher than average. So my question is more about the efficacy of just getting rid of the units in some situations.
Yeah. And so, no, that's well, you know what I'm about to say, that I don't like it. Right. So So when we're doing z-score, so let's take the SAT example, right? So you score, 1380 on the SAT, right? And so now the testing center, they have done all the data. They know where that shows up on the normal distribution. And so, but if you wanted to find out, you would have to know the average and standard deviation, and you would calculate the z-score. And the z-score would give you a percentage, but then I would take that percentage and go back to the original SAT setting and say that the 1380 is in the 17th percentile, right? Or the top 17th percentile or the 83rd percentile, whatever you want to call it. So then like when you're switching over to z-scores, you are coming from some setting, and the z-score helps you in the normalized setting, with mean 0 and standard deviation 1, but you're always coming from something, right? And so, but I also think, to your point about the p-value, right? When you calculate the p-value and the p-value is 0.03, then there is this long sentence we can say, right? This means that, given this, that only 3% of the time, if you do this over and over again, will something like this happen. I don't think that's not sexy, right? That's not interesting, right? And so I think, there are challenges with thinking about z-scores and p-values, in statistics, because the wording isn't standard.
So it seems to me like a lot of the solutions surrounding the ambiguity and problems with units really lie in having the proper explanation in the accompanying text.
Oh, absolutely. Yes, absolutely. And so, yeah, I think that we're big on, so for us, the units are crucial, because after you go through the letter, after you've seen the visual, after you've looked at the axes and the labels, and the things that you're talking about, then when you look at the units of the numbers that you have, you're now able to form a sentence. It's only after the letter U in which you can be like, okay, now I know that you're talking, that this shows how much we spent at this year, how many dollars we spent in this year, right? So you only know that, or how many dollars we spent after 25 years after this start date, right? Period, right? But you can only do that once we know dollars, once we know years, once we know the units. And so the units allow us to make a sentence. We can't make a sentence until we get to letter U, right? And so you're right that the units allow us to actually, this is why we call it the language. The units allow us to then say stuff in our language before we head on to the other two letters. Now, as we head on to the other two letters, once we're able to make a sentence using the units, we then say, okay, well, wait, let's look at the chart. Now, I just made a sentence about the units. What is it that the chart maker said, or what is it that somebody else said about this chart? And does that sentence align with the sentence that I just made, right? And then there might be conflict there, which we write about. And then, of course, after that, you can say, well, wait, who made this? Where did it come from? Where am I seeing it? All of those things. When it comes, this is the last one. I appreciate your time. When it comes to units, how do you see the use case of composite indices? They tend not to have real units since the scores are made up for the sake of the index. Oh, what do you mean? I don't know what you mean. What's a composite index? Do we know what that means?
I do not. Kyle, do you have
Okay, so good. So that'd be great to keep talking about. If you could put a link to an example.
Or if I'm thinking about this the right way, it reminds me of a way that in my work we've used kind of made up scales to identify a severity of a defect when we don't have a good way of measuring it quantitatively.
Yes.
So you picture the area of a surface and you have some defect. How bad is that?
Yes.
And we run into frequently, you judge a scale of like 0 to 3, and you assign some qualitative metric to that. 0 to 3, you might say that's 4 bins. 0 is 1 to 25, 1 is 25 to 50, so on. The problem that I've encountered with those is that as you learn more about it, you might change those bins. And so 0 to 3 months ago was divided in quarters, but now it's divided in thirds.
Yeah.
And now dividing 4 by 3 is its own set of challenge, where 0 becomes 0 and 1 is 0 to 30. But that you still have that same 0 to 3. And so if you start to look at historical data, it really becomes a problem, because now you have to track what made up scale you are actually using for the metric that you have defined.
No, then that's, I mean, it's problematic, and I understand why you have to do that. I mean, obviously the worst case of that, of course, is the GPA, right? Where we assign an A a 4, a B a 3, a C a 2, a D a 1, an F of 0. And then we start adding stuff up, multiplying by credits, dividing, multiplying. And in some states like mine, if you get a 3.0 versus a 2.99, we'll pay your tuition to a school, right? And so then the made upness of the calculation and the numbers, of course, none of these numbers having any units, right, can determine whether you get your college paid for or not, right? But then also you have to do something, right? And so, it's important to think about when you want to assign stuff to numbers, right, to just be careful with it, and that it's bound to be problematic. But you also need something, right?
And even within that scale, there are places and classes where an A is a 5, not a 4.
Right. Exactly. Yeah, I'm looking at people now who are graduating 3.7s. I'm like, how did that happen? like 4.58 GPA. I'm like, wow. Okay, that's right. A couple more minutes. We've been extended.
So when people are making their visualizations,
and
they're putting in the components, they've got the title and the subtitle and the caption and their units, how should they go about asking for feedback on whether the units are appropriate and make sense or not?
No, I have no problem with just saying, does this make sense to you? Because there's something about just showing it, because I think, and you're helping, that's a great question for having us think about this, because I think, and we need to add this actually to the introduction, Kyle, that like a chart should stand on its own, right? Like, I think that, like, in some sense, with the values framework is forcing you all to make sure that we attend to all of the parts. You need to say who it's from, the source. You need to be able to say why you made it, or what the purpose is of why you're making it, in an explanation, some words, right? Every number that you put in your chart should have units, right? And obviously the axes should be labeled, and you should be attending to how it looks, right? I just said all those backwards, but I think that the chart I want to give to somebody, in the ideal, they would say, oh, okay, I'm understanding what it's saying on the level, and I have 3 questions, right? Why did you pick those units? Is this your explanation here? Is this what you want to say, really? And why did you choose these axes? And and it would just be about, those pieces. But I think a general, tell me what you see when you look at this chart. And if their response is aligned to what you want them to see, then it's touchdown, right? It's a touchdown.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Aris, Kyle, for coming on, for teaching us a little bit about units and their importance. They're obviously a critical part of data visualization. Hopefully everybody's a little bit more mindful when they are choosing their units going forward. This talk is recorded and will be up on YouTube sometime in the near future. And please, you have their contact information. If you've any more questions, if you want to know when their book is being published, send them an email. Thank you, everyone, for coming today. And thank you again so much, Aris and Kyle.
Zane, thank you. Data Visualization Society, thank you.
All right. Bye, everyone.
Bye.